All right, folks, welcome to the Monsters, Madness, and Magic podcast. I'm your host, Justin, here with a quick word before we dive in. Now, in this episode, I'm joined by special guest co host Howie Bentley of Cauldron Born and Briton Rites, and we chat with legendary writer Michael Moorcock about drunken nights with Fritz Leiber, Karl Edward Wagner, the sorcery of Elric, Blue Oyster Cult, and more. Now, as a caveat, this is our second interview with Michael. Though it's not necessary, I might encourage you to go listen to the first episode that covers a bit more of his childhood and introduction to writing and things like that. Anyway, as always, thank you for listening. And if you're listening on your podcasting platform of choice and you'd like to help the show grow, please leave us a review. And if you happen to be watching the video on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe because it does help. Anyway, without further ado, here you go. Well, Michael, here we go again.
Yeah.
well, last time, we started a bit by you were talking about your childhood and growing up during the wake of World War II,
Mhm.
and something you said that I thought was interesting that you said the bee bombings never scared you because you were always around the adults and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, what did scare you when you were a kid? What spooked you?
Not an awful lot. I mean, just silly things sometimes. Like when I was at the fair one day, this must have been just after the war. I got to the top of the Helter Skelter, and when I looked down, I I got sort of dizzy, and I had the real ignominy of they gave you little mats to slide down the Helter Skelter on, and I actually walked back down the steps rather than go down the Helter Skelter. I mean, it's the only time I've ever done that. Um, that's the only thing I remember much scaring me. I had an extremely, I suppose you'd just call it happy childhood. I mean, I had a mother who really did take an interest in what I was doing, and when I said I wanted to be a writer, which is when I was 9 or 10, she sent me to a school where I could learn typing and shorthand, so I could be a journalist, which is the practical kind of writer, as it were. Um, which was very sensible of her. I mean, so I really had very little conflict in my. I didn't like boarding school that much, but I think that's probably because my father had left at the end of World War II. I think I probably had a certain amount of separation anxiety just because I then went to boarding school about a year or so later.
Hmm.
And so I was forever running away from the school. The school was okay. I mean, nothing wrong with the school either. I mean, it was a very nice school. Um, and there was it wasn't like the stories you hear about the horrors of English boarding schools. This was not at all horrific. But I just didn't. I did start telling stories there when I must have been 7 then. Mostly derived from Kipling, who wasn't allowed in the school library because he was a little too, I think, conservative or right wing for the school. And Kipling at that point was going through a reassessment where they were seeing him as a spokesperson for empire and all that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So there wasn't any Kipling, but I'd read quite a bit of Kipling. So I told I retold Kipling to my schoolmates. And then because I was doing that, they actually separated me, which suited me, and put me in a separate room. But then what would happen is that the people who were wanting to hear my stories would actually come to the room, at night, sneak out, and I went on telling the same stories, I suppose. Um, but putting myself in the position of Mowgli was not too good because I wasn't very good at climbing. And one day I was stuck up a tree, and somebody said, "Well, you're supposed to be good at doing this." And a master had to come and get me down. So that rather ruined my credibility as a lord of the jungle. Um,
It's funny that you. I think you mentioned last time as well, Michael, that you were never a fan of horror stories or Lovecraft or any sort of that.
yeah,
Howie and I were discussing a few weeks ago that it almost seems that an element of horror is at least necessary in a sword and sorcery story. Do you agree with that? And how did you
yeah, I
go
do
about
agree with
injecting
that. I
that?
mean, I know when the comics first started coming out, I was horrified at what I'd written. I mean, actually, because I'd never rewritten what I'd read. I think there's an element of I don't know, not trauma is too strong a word, but of release in writing that sort of thing that I don't really need in reading it. I think it's I mean, as it were, I can hand it out, but I can't take it. Um, so yeah, I mean, and I did write a few sort of horror stories when I was very young, but it's really is. I mean, I don't like Lovecraft much because I don't like his writing much,
Mm.
but M.R. James, who's a very good writer, I find as difficult to read as Lovecraft a lot of the time because M.R. James really scares the crap out of me. I mean, it's serious. It's very very close to to reality, so it's not as distant. The other thing is I really like octopuses. I like all forms, um, and so the idea of tentacled creatures doesn't really scare me much. I mean, I think, oh, nice, tentacled creature. Um, and in in my own books, I've got a, a, a squid the size of a universe, which is a very benign and benevolent squid. So I've never really taken the Lovecraft viewpoint on monstrosities.
Lovecraft had there was the Lovecraft Circle. So is there? I know you were friends with Fritz Leiber. Is there a Michael
Yeah.
Moorcock Circle?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not well. I think you have to. In Lovecraft's case, it was letters, and they were writing letters back and forth. These days we have well, a lot of different sites you can communicate with people on, and I just use Facebook pretty much in that way, I suppose. But I don't really. The nearest that I came to that was, and I didn't really join. I'm not a great joiner of things, and I'm not a great. I don't like to be, as it were, in charge of things. Even though I've been an editor for I don't know how long, I still don't much like that position. I was in, I think it was called Saga, the Swordsman, and I don't know, something group that Lynn Carter started. But I think Lynn started it pretty much for his own benefit because he just told you that you were in it. And and then said, we're having a mini convention or whatever, And I never actually went to any of those, mostly because they were in America. But even the ones in England, I didn't go to, usually because I had something more, to me, more interesting to do. I mean, Fritz and I were in that. Fritz and I were friends, but I don't think we discussed sword and sorcery much as such. I mean, little bit, of course, just in the course of things. I mean, I'm not. I don't think I'm revealing anything about Fritz when I say that he was usually too drunk to get into a serious discussion about anything. But he was very, very good at. He could remember narrative poems, whole massive narrative verse, and because of his Shakespearean training from his father, he could really let rip. And for a while, I had a wonderful tape of. I think it was called Otranto. I think it was a G.K. Chesterton narrative poem, which Fritz sent me on tape because I mean he'd done it. He could do this just off the drop of a hat. But Fritz sent me the tape, but it was it was one of those little tiny reel to reels, and I never really had much to play it on. I should have transferred it, but I didn't. It may now be probably it's in the Bodleian Library somewhere, with my other stuff. But that was great. I mean, just listening to Fritz was good enough for me. And he was very smart too, and very kind man, nice man.
That reminds me of a story that was an intro I think you had written for one of the Fawford and the Grey Mouser volumes
Hmm.
when they published those again.
Yeah,
And you
yeah,
were talking about you and Fritz being in New York traffic, and that was a humorous story.
yeah.
You mind
Well,
to
yeah.
tell everybody about that?
Well, I mean, it was me, Judy Merrill, and Jim Salas, and we were, and Jim was said that he knew New York, but it turned out that when we got to New York, he didn't know it that well and actually panicked. So he's driving this old car of Judy's, um, big old station wagon in the middle of New York traffic, and Jim just sort of has a panic attack, and and just stops in the middle of everything. It's all hooting and shouting and raving around us, but he says, "I can't go on. I can't do it." So Fritz, who was both stoned and drunk as a skunk, said, because Judy wouldn't do it. I don't know why. And I wasn't going to do it. Not. I mean, it was totally unfamiliar to me, and driving on the wrong side of the road, all sorts of stuff. And so we had to get Fritz, who was quite happily in the back seat, sort of just I don't know what he was doing, just being drunk and having a good time on his own, really. And we had to get him and shove him in the front seat because he was the only person who knew New York well enough to get us out of the spot that Jim had driven us into. I think Jim's a lot calmer these days, and so I don't think it'd happen again. But it was we had a lot of fun together. I suppose it was the '60s.
Wasn't he reciting Shakespeare while he was doing this?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, Shakespeare was one of his great loves. I mean, and he originally started off, as you know, as a Shakespearean, part of his father's Shakespearean theatre company. And you'll see Fritz in a classic Garbo film. The what's it called? Marguerite. It's the Lady of the Camellias, and he plays in that. You'll see him briefly, and he's playing Robert. Well, the lead star. I can't remember his name either. A famous actor. Oh, Robert Taylor. He and Robert Taylor can be seen in that film. Doing a bit of elegant back and forth. They're supposed to be salonier of some kind. Just fops of the day. At least he is, and his father is in I think it's Captain Blood, and he plays the judge in I think it's Captain Blood in the Errol Flynn movie, and the shooting of that was wonderful because it was very much German expressionism influenced, and they shot upwards at the judge who appeared to be in this vast distance upwards. And that was Fritz's father. So there are little bits of Fritz all over the early or pre-war movies. I don't think he did much in the later after the war. He was writing by then anyway, pretty successfully, I think.
Karl Edward Wagner wrote an Elric story. He was the first
Yeah,
writer I can remember reading who wrote Elric into one of his stories with his iconic character Kane.
yeah.
Now, did you know Karl?
Yeah, I knew Carl pretty well. Again, Carl, you didn't meet Carl sober very often, so it was pretty much the same sort of deal. That you sat there while Carl, gave forth. Um, but but yeah, I got on well with Carl. I was very very sad when he died. I mean, it was a great shame, great loss. But like a lot of writers, he was his own worst enemy. I don't really know what killed him. Actually, I can't imagine it was drink at that early age. Although
Mm.
a friend of mine died at 34, I think, of cirrhosis. So it is
Wow.
possible to do if you really put your mind to it to die of drink at an early age.
Speaking of which, what's your opinion on writing under the influence of alcohol or other substances?
That's up to other people. I mean, I really don't do it. I've never done it. People used to say in the 60s, when I was kind of, part of the, whatever you call it, underground movement, alternative movement, whatever, because I was in a lot of underground newspapers and stuff like that, as well as doing the Elrics and Hawkmoons and so on. They used to say that I was doing it all on acid. I could only be doing it on acid. The same as they said about Phil Dick. Phil never used acid for writing either. I mean, he used speed to keep himself awake, but he didn't use acid. I didn't use anything. I just strong sweet coffee. That was really it, and I just had that going most of the day. But I didn't. Not while I was working. I was very puritanical. And I also had young kids, I had kids I was raising, helping raise. So I wasn't, it was only, I bought a lot of life insurance fairly early on. So my kids and my wife would be okay. And then I kind of had I would let myself off as a sort of, vacation, as it were, for doing all the bad things. But I didn't do anything like that when writing. I knew writers who could write perfectly coherently, and get a book out about the same time as me, about 2 or 3 days. I could write that fast, but all of those writers, I think without exception, began as journalists. And you get to drinking a lot when you're a journalist. I mean, it's just part of the sort of the group. Everybody meets in the pub. Everybody exchanges the gossip that comes out as news a bit later. I realized fairly. I mean, I think it was probably about the mid to late 60s that I was drinking 8 pints of beer at lunchtime and not feeling it. And I started to reduce after that. So I'm a very, I don't get addicted to anything. I mean, that's one good thing, really. It's very hard for me to get addicted. So it's very easy for me to stop. That's really been, while I'm working, I don't do anything. When I'm not working, which is not very often, really, or if I was with the band, if I was doing work with the band, that would be different too, because everybody was on something then, and you just went along with whatever happened to be on offer, really, except for heroin, which again I never got addicted to, but I hate the stuff. It's nasty stuff. That was my life. I mean, I was a working writer with a family to support. I couldn't really afford to get too crazy, while working. But I was very crazy when not working.
Has an idea ever came to you, Michael, while in an altered state? Not necessarily alcohol, maybe another substance.
No, not really. I'd say to a degree, marijuana, you can get ideas, but you can't do much with them. At least I can't. And they're not always that great, the ideas, when when you actually come to read them back. Also, the other thing is my writing's pretty bad normally, but it's really bad when I'm in an altered state. So I can't even read what I've written anyway. No, I don't think so. It's just, I think what I've got is which I've come to note over the years, just because it's my job. There are people who are romantics who are constantly having to rein in their imaginations, find sort of disciplined ways of making that work. In the early 18th century and a bit later, I suppose it was probably Byron and Shelley and so on. They had meter and stuff to keep them reined in. There are others who admire romanticism and try to repeat it, and it's sort of easier for them in some ways, because I'm one of those people who just needs to rein in. I just have too many ideas and too much stuff. I don't think I'm crazy. My mother was crazy, so maybe I'm crazy. I don't know, but I never had a chance to be very crazy because I was too busy working. It's a funny. I'm a very very practical, very kind of I don't know, ordinarily disciplined sort of person by nature. And it enables me somehow it's enabled me to keep that imagination restrained or find ways of containing it rather than restraining it. So, my later books, ones I'm writing now, are very, very strange, but they take, I'm just talking to somebody the other day, it's a bit like trying to tune an instrument with 1,000 strings. You have to get everyone in tune, and then go for it. So you can't really do that. You might be able to do it once or twice if you're out of your mind on something, but I don't think you can do it again and again, which is what I feel I've been able to do at any rate. In different forms as well. What I do is I give myself a harder task every time I sit down to write a book. I give myself something that's different or harder to do. Not always successfully, but that way you retain vitality. I think the reason that, writers like me, writers who are very fertile, and produce an awful lot of work, they tend to repeat themselves a lot. And in order not to do that, I find you have to set yourself a new task, something that's a bit harder to aim for, because that's initially what gives your work its vitality. You don't really know what you're doing. It's like going into a recording studio, not really knowing quite what you're going to come out doing. But you've got to make sure everything's working and everything's set for you to be able to do that. Maybe doing music helps. I don't know.
Are you a day writer or a night writer?
Well, I used to be daytime. It used to be because, again, with having young kids, I'd get the kids to school, or depending. I mean, my wife was doing stuff. We're both doing that. Either getting kids ready for school, giving them their breakfast, or taking them to school, or whatever. And that usually meant that by 9:30 or 10, I was ready to work. And then I'd work until lunchtime. I'd have an hour off for lunch. And then I'd work, I suppose, until supper time, or unless I had to pick the kids up, which I had to do. So it was a very unromantic lifestyle, really. It was nearly all just working of one sort or another. So that was daytime. Nowadays, once my kids had grown up, it took me probably another 5 years to realize that I didn't have to be in the same place at the same desk, doing working the same way. And I loosened up a lot then. I also loosened up a lot in what I'd become in a way too good at doing what I did, and it tended to limit so I had to find things I couldn't do and try to do them, as it were. I had months for working as well. I didn't work in the summer because my kids had the summer holidays. So I was very very lucky in that respect. I could give the kids my whole time. I worked until, I don't know, June, July, and then I'd work from September onwards. I still have that impulse to write according to school terms, but nowadays I can go. We started going to Morocco quite a lot, and I found that I could work in Morocco, and that was the first time I really started working away from a desk, in an office, as it were.
So speaking in general terms, in Sword and Sorcery, your Conan or your barbarian type protagonist, sorcery is seen as foul and something that needs to be vanquished. But with Elric, you seem to embrace the more sorceress aspect. Did that come about from a natural creation of the character, or were you consciously trying to do something a bit different with the sorcery?
I was trying to do something a bit different, that's for sure. After thinking that the editor had commissioned a Conan story, which I'd actually had started to write for a different editor, realized that he didn't want that he wanted something different, which was, I thought, it was good for me. And I already had Elric kind of, starting. I'd been working on him as an idea for a couple of years before I wrote the first story.
Probably get tired of talking about Elric, but I'm going to have to ask you something about Elric. I think this is where it's pronounced, the Melniboné race. Were they?
Yes.
were they based on any historical ancient race?
No, they were purely invented. I mean, as much as you can say that. I mean, obviously, I must have had influences because you don't work without influences. But I wasn't particularly conscious of any original for them. Or Elric. There were originals for Elric in that I read a lot of Gothic novels. I knew a lot of I'd read a lot of 19th century Gothic novels, as well as what are called Bloods or Penny Dreadfuls and the Spring-Heeled Jack and Sweeney Todd and Dick Turpin and that sort of thing. I was very familiar with a form that had begun to get a little bit atrophied, in my view anyway, of fantasy, of that kind of fantasy. I was really trying to do something as different as I could, but happily I already had all of these influences. And I think Melmoth the Wanderer was which is a well-known Gothic, virtually unreadable apparently to anybody except me. It's one of those Victorian novels that has a story within a story within a story within a story. In the end, you don't know what the hell's going on. You kind of desperately try to find out where the main characters got to. So that was lucky for me. At the same time as I was writing Elric, I was also writing a series for the same magazine, Science Fantasy magazine, in which I was discussing the history of fantasy and the origins of fantasy. So I was doing a lot of research at the same time, and it all helped build the idea of the Melnibonéans and Elric and so on. But I don't think once or twice in the past, I've tried to use something that's derived from somewhere else, and it just doesn't satisfy me enough. I feel better just making my own art. Well, there are obviously, as I say, there are obviously influences, but by and large, I'm much happier. I write much better and faster, for that matter, if I'm making it up myself. If I'm not borrowing from somewhere else.
Howie and I were just talking with Ramsey Campbell recently,
Mm-hmm.
and he mentioned that his earliest attempts at writing were basically, pastiches, copies of writers that he was a fan of, and he couldn't break and find his own voice until he consciously attempted to break away from that. Did you have a similar experience with your?
Yes, when I was 15, I started a series called Sagan the Swordsman, which was very derived from Edgar Rice Burroughs. They've been collected once or twice since and revised once or twice since. They're not really, they're not very good. They were published initially. Well, finally, they were published in Tarzan Adventures, but I'd published the first one or two in my Edgar Rice Burroughs fanzine. All of the Cauldron fanzines, I didn't know anything about fanzines. It was just an amateur magazine as far as I was concerned that I was doing. And the first one was called Outlaw's Own, and that had little stories in it. Probably there must have been one or two. I haven't got any copies now. Must have been one or two that were probably imitations of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I was a huge Burroughs fan, and I think still some of the cadences of Burroughs. It's people don't seem to think Burroughs had a style, but he did have a style, and it was pretty much a style of his day, I suppose. It definitely influenced me. So it gives a lot of my work a slight flavor of the traditional kind of fantasy adventure, I think. I don't tend to write it in a modern style, whereas something like Jerry Cornelius is all modern style. I'm very naturally able to structure and work in pretty much any style I either create or like from somewhere else. I've always believed, with Ramsey, that people learn by imitation. The way you learn to draw by imitation, you learn to write by imitation. And I certainly, as my writing became more ambitious, I would take a novel, for instance, the best example I can give is, there were others, but this is the best example, was a very minor book by Joseph Conrad, very minor and not considered to be very good. But I wasn't going to try and imitate one of his good ones because I couldn't possibly have done it. So for a book called The Ice Schooner, I used the plot of Conrad's, God, I can't remember the name of the story, but it's not a very well-known story. It's best if you're going to pinch something that isn't very well known. So yes, I did. I learned by imitation. I've always believed in learning by imitation. I've got a huge library of 19th century fiction, which is, I suppose, where you go when you're trying to write narrative of the sort that certainly that I write. And I think that a lot of that, a lot of science fiction writers and fantasy writers were rejecting modernism and the internalization, if you like, of the novel, which some people would call navel gazing. Although I like those two, the best of them too. But it got to the point where I just wasn't interested in the average modernist novel, which was usually somebody, I don't know, being a fisherman for 3 weeks, and on a trawler or something of that sort. So I've always enjoyed invention, other people's and my own. And the Victorians did it, just did it very well. I think although Tolkien, of course, did the 3 volumes of Lord of the Rings, it wasn't planned as 3 volumes, I don't think. I learned a lot from the 3-volume novel, which was pretty much every ambitious novelist had to write in 3 volumes in the 19th century, because the libraries insisted on it, because they could charge per volume. So they didn't like it if you just did 1 volume. You had to do, and they charged a huge price so that people would borrow them rather than buy them. So anyway, I learned a lot from that. I remember George Eliot complaining that she had to write the middle volume, which was always the volume, and you can find this quite often in Victorian fiction. It's the volume that sags a bit, where the person's obviously treading water for a while until they get on with the story in the final volume. And I did learn, I learned a lot. The Hawkmoon books were actually the first books I think I wrote, well, amongst the first books that I wrote very, very consciously in terms of their structure. If you look at the manuscript or even the printed copies, each one ends on exactly the same page. It's 180 pages of manuscript, and every one of the first 4 Hawkmoons were done that way. And they were done again in a sort of musical sense, in that they had if you like, an opening of an exposition and a resolution. I still write like that. Even when I'm writing in a non-linear way, which I'm doing at the moment, you still have to have a sense of resolution in the story, or people feel cheated, and as they should. I'm very moralistic about what a writer should deliver to his reader. The reader, particularly, if the reader doesn't like it, they won't buy it. So that's the simple basis.
Michael, you've collaborated with a lot of bands over your career. I just want to ask you specifically about your work with a Blue Oyster Cult. How did that come about, and how did you guys get together?
Well, Eric got in touch with me, Eric Bloom. I think I was staying at the same hotel. No, I was staying at the same hotel as their crew. They were staying at a better hotel than the crew, but I was staying at the crew's hotel, which is now an incredibly posh and expensive New York hotel, the way it's happened all over. So I was staying there, and I think he found out from my agent that I was staying there and called me at the hotel. I was working there, I think, in the hotel room, and came to see me and said, how about doing some lyrics? And I have a lot of lyrics because I've got my own band, and I worked a lot with Hawkwind. So I gave him the lyrics that I had, or some of the lyrics that I had available. And from then on, we just went on. I'm not working with Eric anymore, but I'm working with Albert and some of the other members of the band. We're doing stuff for Spirits Burning, which is I think it's a four set records of my end of time stories, and they're very interesting musically. I mean, they've got, I think, literally dozens of good musicians on them. Some from Hawkwind, some from Blue Oyster Cult, some from the, I suppose, what you'd call our circle. You know, the people that we've worked with over time, different times. Not always just full-time members of the band, but people who've done session work and so on. So I enjoy doing that. In fact, I've enjoyed doing that with Albert, and more than probably I did with Blue Oyster Cult, because I was just writing lyrics for Blue Oyster Cult, and with the Spirits Burning set, you know, I'm singing and doing what little playing I can now do. I mean, my hands are just crap now, so I can't play, but I can play the harmonica. so where it's called for, I'm your man for harmonica. It's not called for very much, certainly not in Blue Oyster Cult terms. No, I work mostly with my own band and with Hawkwind. I mean, I'd work with anybody really who was interesting. I mean, you know, the way those bands were. It was easy for me. I mean, it was all part of the same culture. You know, I lived right smack in the middle of what was considered to be the where a lot of musicians lived there. You know, Jimi Hendrix died there, but the Ladbroke Grove, Portobello Road area really was just chock-a-block with musicians and poets and so on. So not so much writers, actually. I was one of the few writers. But then I was also, I didn't seem to have the prejudices a lot of people had. Most of the writers that I knew, both American and English, pretty much all of them initially that I knew, really didn't want to get involved with, say, the rock and roll world or the alternate world at all. Whereas I'd been in bands since I was 15. Not very good bands, but since I was 15, there's actually a demo that came to light fairly recently, which is just dreadful. People say it's not as dreadful as I think, but I think it is pretty dreadful. It's an early attempt at very bad rock and roll, straight rock and roll. But anyway, I did that when I was, I think, 16 or 17, but I'd been playing since I was 15. I suppose it's also, you know, I left school when I was 15. I had too much to do. I was too busy, really, to want to, you know, stay at school. And it never occurred to me to go, well, it barely occurred to me to go to college. I mean, I'd discuss it when the subject was open to me, but I never really intended to go.
Just curious, not many writers are fortunate enough to get to write a character like you have with Elric over so many years. So when you sit down to write Elric now, as you know, you're older and wiser, have you noticed that the character himself has changed with the creator?
Well, I think he has, which is a shame in a way, because of course I'm writing mostly prequels. And the last book that I wrote, I really, in a way, should have been an earlier book. There's a little too much exposition in it, in my view. I shouldn't be saying this because the publisher won't like me saying it. But I think, I mean, it's not a totally bad book, but it's got quite a lot more character development going on in it, and it's almost as if I'm trying to catch up on what I should have said earlier. So yeah, all of my characters, my major characters, are all as if they were friends of mine, or really that, just people who I already knew or already know. So when I come to write the story, I don't feel, I rarely read my own work. I won't say I never have, but I very rarely read it. I didn't proof anything for years. I'm a bit more disciplined now, but I'd send the manuscript to the publisher unread, and the publisher would print it unread a lot of the time because they knew my name sold books, I suppose. I mean, they just, so nobody read it. Between me writing it and the reader reading it, there's no process being involved at all. It's just straight as I wrote it, which is nice in a way. And so Elric is an easy character for me to write. I wrote a short Elric story where he was a young man. I haven't done that much where he's particularly young. I did a comic with Walter Simonson, which is still, I think a pretty good story of Elric when he was younger, before before any of the main adventures started. Well, I've developed some of him through comics, but I've also mostly developed him through other books, stories. Like coming back to an old friend and finding another aspect of his character, that you maybe knew a bit about, but not a whole lot about. But you can't do that too often, as I think I discovered with this last one. I used to write in threes, as I've said, in essentially in threes. So I'd write three what were essentially novellas, and they would be a novel, like Sailor on the Seas of Fate is a good example with Elric. That's how I learned to write. I started writing 3,000 word stories, went up to 5,000 word stories. Then I did 15,000 word stories. And then I went up, in increments until I could write a full length novel. I was basically teaching myself, how to do it. And also encouraging myself to do it, because it's easier to think of 15,000 words. It doesn't seem so daunting as if you start with a novel. I think I admire anybody who starts off with a novel. I never did. I started off with novellas. Comics helped as well. I was writing an awful lot of comics in the early days. And the disciplines of writing comics are, they're pretty high, the actual discipline, if not the invention. Structuring, I learned a lot of structuring through doing single page comic stories or short serials or whatever. And I also learned, I tend, when I'm starting a new book, I tend to go back to doing a bit of journalism, because journalism makes you tighten up your style, and it stops you getting too long drawn out and windy. You really, if you're told, you've got 800 words to do something, then you've got 800 words, and it's got to be, short and sharp, and and do the job. So I still tend to return to journalism as just to get myself in shape for doing a novel that isn't going to bore everybody silly.
Michael, has your process to writing changed since the early years? Are you a heavy outliner, or do you just like to go with the flow and edit later?
I've rarely done outlines. I do a little bit of an outline. What I do, the Hawk Moon books are probably the best example of a system, in that I used to stay in bed for 3 days, thinking the novel through, not really making many notes, but maybe a couple of notes, not much, but just, as it were, almost sleeping on it until I was ready. Then I literally would leap out of bed and start working. I'd be in bed thinking about the novel for 3 days. It would take me 3 days to write the novel, and then I would have 3 days in which I recovered from writing the novel. So I suppose, in a sense, it was 9 days in all. My wife at the time and kids got used to me working that way. I was rather shocked when other people's children came over and didn't have respect for either me being in bed, or when they actually, when they showed disrespect to a manuscript. My poor kids, I remember them looking in horror when writer friend of mine, Jimmy Ballard, he would come over quite a lot with his kids, who were rather just around the same age as mine. They would just be amazed that these kids would actually walk on a sheet of paper, because I used to lay out the chapters on the floor of my room. And they were, that was it's just how I did it. The kids were used to, as it were, weaving their way between many sheets of paper, because my wife also was a writer, and always were a bit shocked by children who didn't have respect for for that system of work.
Do you still find time to read, and if so, what sort of fiction do you read nowadays?
That is what I have to admit I don't do. I've lost, for the time being, I've lost most else to read at any length. there are certain favorite writers that I like to read, but they're not particularly good for me to read while I'm working. So I don't, and I've been working. I mean, this is going to be my last ever novel, the one I'm working on now. I'm going to be working on doing short stories and novellas and stuff from now on. I'm getting too old for taking on a novel. It gives me no free time, and makes me grumpy and all the rest of it.
Takes a lot of energy.
So, well, yeah, it does. It does. I'm lucky in that I seem to, still be pretty energetic. I mean, I'm totally crap. I mean, I've got neuropathy and spinal something or other. I mean, I can barely walk two paces without without screeching with girlish pain. But I seem to be okay when I'm sitting down. I mean, I did have a physical therapist, and I follow those exercises, but there's nothing you can do about the spinal problem, because it's just basically your back's falling apart. It's just what happened. And it's just bad luck. It's not, there's nothing I could have done to have stopped it. That's what I've been told anyway. Some people have a certain kind of back which deteriorates, and other people, have a back that doesn't deteriorate. But it's nothing to do with anything else. So I'm okay. I'm okay, say here, writing a book or sitting down chatting. It takes me quite a lot of effort to walk once around the house. It's quite a lot of space, but it's still hard to do.
Can you tell us anything about this novel that you're working on now, or is it too early?
No, it's not too early. I'm getting near to the end of it. It's the end. It's the last of two others. Well, it's the third of another trilogy. It's partly. I was asked to write an autobiography by my publisher, Jonathan Cape, some years ago. And I said, well, I don't really want to write an autobiography because there's a chance of hurting people's feelings, or if the people are dead, their children's feelings, or relatives, that sort of thing. I just didn't want to do it, because if I wanted to tell the truth, I didn't know who would be upset or not by what I was saying. I mean, I tried to tell the truth about myself, but also about events. So in the end, in discussion with a friend in Paris, Jean-Luc Frontal, he said, well, why don't you write an autobiographical novel? And that way, you won't be, you won't have to give the right names necessarily, and so on. So I started doing that. But I also wanted to write a novel about fantasy, about the appeal and lure of fantasy fiction, about how I might have used it as an escape from other, more other sort of moral issues, if you like, or things I might have done better in my life, whether it's raising my children or being married or whatever it was. So there's a lot of self-examination in it, but not in the way that the person's just sitting down and talking about themselves. It's a mixture of pretty wild adventure, and all three books are like this: self-examination and examination of the time, discussion of what was going on at the time, writers that I was working with, all of that stuff. I mean, and also a certain amount of absurdism, because I've always really liked absurdism. So I've got characters from the multiverse comic mostly, who are in there, the sailors of the second ether. My multiverse theory has expanded and become more disciplined, I think. It's not just an idea of, there are a lot of different universes, but how that might be mathematically. And I was luckily helped in that by reading Mandelbrot and looking at the Mandelbrot systems anyway. So I do have a very clear idea of what the multiverse is. Also, how we probably can't travel in the multiverse, and what we would have to be able to do to travel in the multiverse. and so on. So that idea, which was the theme, I mean, very crudely, the theme of my first science fiction novel, The Sundered Worlds. And this is, I suppose, a development of that running through it. But it's not, I mean, again, it's not a science fiction novel. It's not a fantasy novel. It's not an autobiographical novel, but it is at least all three of those.
Wow.
Plus a sort of surreal elements in it. So, and at the same time, of course, you have to keep the reader reading. I mean, they have to remain interesting while you go off at a wild tangent, which may be what I was taught, maybe too much of an influence of Melmoth the Wanderer, but I don't think so. I think it's got, I've been doing this for a few years now, but it's a world where the highwaymen of the sort of 18th century, people like Dick Turpin, are they don't hold up stagecoaches. They hold up trams, and there's a tram system, an electric tram system that goes all over England, and they hold up the trams and do the and steal from the rich and give to the poor and all that stuff.
Hand over your lupins.
Yeah, well, no. What they say to the tram driver is, throw down your lever, because tram drivers have this lever that they click into place when they're driving. So they have to throw down their lever, which of course means the tram can't move, and then they come aboard and roll the rich passengers and give the money to the tram drivers union, because the tram drivers are being badly exploited. So I mean, and that comes out of an idea for in London. There used to be a number of places which were retreats, really, where you could go, sanctuaries, where if you were a debtor particularly, but for other crimes as well, you could go into these areas, and the king's men, the soldiers or the police of the day, couldn't actually arrest you. You were safe once you were inside that. And the best known one was run by the White Friars. They're frequently attached to religious institutions where within the space, owned by the abbey or the church or whatever, you were safe. And once you got into that space, you were safe. So I've got this. It's called Alsatia, and it's just off Fleet Street. So it's to me, it's very mixed up with Fleet Street, my own life in Fleet Street, as a journalist, and the sort of, I suppose, the penny dreadfuls, the bloods that I used to enjoy reading. It's also about music. I mean, quite a lot about bands I've been in or written for, and so on. In fact, all the questions you're asking me now are probably all answered in that book.
Wow.
So better hold off the book until.
Hey, we're definitely looking forward to that, Michael. We're coming up on our hour here. Definitely don't want to get in trouble with Linda.
No, I don't know. I think she might be. The good thing is that there's a big football series going on, English football. She loves English football, so she's quite often distracted by.
She left you off to your own devices.
Yes, yeah. But once the game's over, I'm in trouble.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you again, Michael. We'll have to do it again down the road, and we look forward to that novel.
Yeah, well, good. Hope you enjoy it.
And you have a great rest of your day, man.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.